make sure that that program doesn't contain controversial subjects, and you're not impolite to people.
No, definitely not, Dad. You know me. I'm never, ever controversial or impolite.
Yeah. Okay.
Welcome to Conversations with your lovable, never pisses anyone off, ex-Muslim host Aina, keeping it non-controversial. Welcome to panel 12 on the intersection of technology and religion. I have here with me two tech guys who are also ex-religionists. I will let them introduce themselves, and me, you know me, I'm here representing the tech incompetent side. Yay! So hello guys, how's it going?
Hi there. Hello, I'm Albert Billings. I work in technology and security and web browsers down in Silicon Valley. I won't talk about where I work because they probably don't approve it. But I've been doing this since the early 90s in a variety of capacities, but the last few years I've mostly been working in security.
Cool.
Nice. So I'm Bob Caswell. I grew up Mormon, so that's my religious cred, and my family is still Mormon. I started working at a white box computer store in the mid-90s, building custom computers. Then I went on a Mormon mission toward the end of that decade, and then came back and continued on with techie stuff, did IT consulting for 5 to 6 years, and then went back to school, got my MBA, and then worked at Microsoft as a product manager. And since 2013, I've been working and living here in Silicon Valley, working for an enterprise software company. I'll follow Albert's lead and not say who I work for, but you can find me online. Yeah, that's me.
Yeah, I'm not. You could find me pretty easily online if you want to look. Should I give a brief bio of my religious background as well? I grew up...
Sure.
Yeah, go for it.
I grew up Roman Catholic. My mother was a convert from Methodism when I was, 4 or 5 years old. I was Roman Catholic, an altar boy and all that until my mid-teens, and then got involved with neo-paganism, specifically Wicca. Met my first wife through that. And eventually in the early 2000s became a Buddhist, which I still largely practice, but we'll talk about nuances of that. And I still have a lot of friends in the neo-pagan community. But other than relatives, I don't have much of a connection with Christianity anymore. Oh, and to Bob's background, I spent the age 9 through about 14 living in Salt Lake City, Utah. So I had a significant middle school Stranger Things era connection with various Mormons in the Mormon church, but not personally, other than through school and friends.
Nice. Never mow.
Yes.
Never
mow.
Yeah, it's so interesting. I guess you have not been asked before to give your tech cred and religious cred or ex-religious cred at the same time.
I know, right? That's a first for me.
Does not normally come up where we work now, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah, so tell me, did tech or the internet have anything to do with like your loss of faith? Or I know, Al, you say you still practice Buddhism, but the times that you have left religion.
So I was on the internet actually very early on. I got on around 1988 or 89 through. I went to community college and was in computer clubs. So I was on I was on late period Usenet through the early 90s, which is long forgotten by most people, but was kind of message boards that ran on the largely educational internet. And I ran computer bulletin board systems for a number of years with friends with dial-up modems, FidoNet, and all that. And so in that era, actually, I was largely functioning as a neo-pagan, and I would say it definitely had an impact on why or how I kind of left Catholicism. But there was definitely a kind of California subculture of pagans, freaks, and weirdos on various message boards and the internet of that era. Very much the kind of the California ideology, utopian tech crowd coming out of then. And so there's both kind of an attitude against religion, but definitely an undercurrent of people involved with this weird stuff, whether they identified it as religious or not. And so I would think that played a significant impact because I had a community of both people my age and people older that were somewhat skeptical of religious claims, but also, trading amongst themselves in their little subcultures of things they were into.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And Bob?
Yeah, so slightly different trajectory, I guess. I did the whole AOL CompuServe thing, but that was like, I was in middle school when that was happening. And then the internet, when it started to take off more in the mid to late 90s, I used it more for gaming. And I was still a true believing Mormon and growing up Mormon, and Mormonism allows for you to participate in, regular life stuff. And Mormons were kind of afraid of the internet a little bit, but then sort of embraced it in their own special way. Mormons have a thing where like any new tech retroactively becomes from God for the purposes of making Mormonism better.
Oh, isn't that convenient?
Yeah, yeah, right. So then I went on my Mormon mission for a couple of years, and then I got much more into the internet, and I was part of the original Mormon blogging scene. So Mormon blogging took off around 2002, 2003, and it was first kind of reserved more for liberal Mormons who wanted to self-identify as intellectual more so. Not that conservative Mormons, I feel like I have to add disclaimers with all of this because it's not that they're not intellectual, but there are certain topic areas that you don't go into if you're just more of a standard practicing Mormon. But then there are some Mormons who like to make a bigger deal out of exploring the unknown a little bit more. And so I got into that for a few years, and that certainly did lead to what we call my faith crisis, which happened in 2007, where it all sort of came to a head. And I was like, oh my gosh, they are not what they purport to be, and there's all sorts of problems here. Mm-hmm. So I say the internet directly contributed, but it's different for every Mormon, and now especially the church is really grappling with it because so much information is so easily available. Where you used to have to go to the library or get a book, which is kind of how I found out about a lot of the stuff that led to my crisis of faith.
Mm-hmm.
Most of that's just a click away now. So.
Yeah.
So, Bob, I have a question for you. Did you ever run into, I believe it was called the Saints Alive, or I don't remember the names of all the websites, but in the 90s, there were a number of ex-Mormons or Mormon antagonists that were getting a hold of various internal church documents and rituals and putting them up on the internet. And I think they're evangelical Christians. They were trying to witness to Mormons to pull them away from the church. And that was a big thing in the 90s, along with the anti-Scientology stuff that was going on.
Yeah, no, I didn't get into any of that because the thing with Mormons is they're quick to disregard anything that's negative press from the outside. What's much more convincing and what led me to leave is more information that was provided to me through other active Mormons. So there's kind of two types of Mormon awakenings, I guess, or sources of information. There is that evangelical group that wants to discredit Mormonism and make it so that they're not part of the same team, so to speak. Like, you're not Christian or religious, you're just weird, you're a cult. And then Mormons are quick to be like, don't listen to them. And even me to this day, like, I don't give that as much credit because they have an agenda. Mm-hmm. But then other Mormons who are just historians or honestly seeking to just find the truth of how the church originated or what the real history is, that's much more compelling because you see them as your friends, as your neighbors, as part of your community. And when they start producing or providing information, then you take it more seriously. And that's really what started to happen more in the post 2000 era. The 90s anti-Mormon stuff was more from the outside.
Mm-hmm. Interesting.
That's interesting. And I can relate to that too, because a lot of people, when it comes to Islam, have an agenda in criticizing it, right? And so that to me has never been convincing to like join hands with conservative Christians or,
right.
To just shit on Islam. But what actually changed my mind on a lot of stuff is just reading the scriptures myself, translated, because a lot of this stuff has to be read in Arabic still. And so a lot of people don't know what they're reading. And we also get taught like very curated, all the nicer stuff. I didn't even know like about the existence of some of the horrific verses or hadith until I started looking it up on the internet and reading English translations, and I was like, wow.
I assume you've read like Michael Muhammad Knight, some of his work before. I don't know if you've brought that up on the podcast.
No.
Oh, he's the one that did the what was it called? Well, he's the one that wrote the was it Taco Cores?
Oh, okay, right.
Made them up as a novel, and then kind of he is a white American, blue-eyed, as he says, convert to Islam. And he's had a problematic, which he talks about quite a bit, back and forth with it. But one of his books, and I don't remember which one it was, maybe it was his one about Islam and DMT and drugs. He talks about like actually studying the Quran himself, in translation and whatnot, and kind of the problematic to him, maybe not problematic, but complex relationship with Scripture that he as a convert who doesn't read Arabic really has, and trying to understand, like, how various groups that kind of come from a more, multi-generational family, ethnic kind of background relate to the text and the religion than he does as an American convert who didn't even grow up Muslim.
Well, it's not even that they relate to it. They just never question. It's just never been questioned. You just grow up accepting it, right? That's just how it is. And then you have to find some sort of twisted justification for whatever verse it is, even though it may go against your values, but you just know that you cannot question this.
That's interesting because for the Mormon side of things, the actual morality or questioning of the stories and their usefulness kind of comes later often as people find their way out. And what I mean to say is that historicity is usually the first problem. So, Joseph Smith, our prophet, he translated another book of scripture from gold plates, and it's called the Book of Mormon. And
I've seen the musical.
Yeah, so you know all about it. That's completely accurate, I'm sure.
Of course.
No, I've seen it several times, and actually they get most of it right, which is kind of funny. So I just want to point out that, at first, you don't question the actual tenets of the faith or what's written in the words, even if some of it is similarly placed or positioned like stories in the Bible that are kind of batshit crazy. What started me down the path was some studies that suggested that, gasp, the book wasn't actually ancient record, but, might have been written in the 19th century.
Oh my.
And so that was kind of, and this is a common thing for a lot of Mormons. It's not that they jump straight to like, oh, that's a weird doctrine, or why am I living by this standard? It's more like, oh, is that accurately a book from ancient Israel, or was it really written in the 19th century? And as soon as you get enough evidence to suggest that there's anachronistic references, there's lots of stuff that's lifted from other sources. There's lots to suggest that Joseph Smith wrote it himself or with the help of others. There's all sorts of theories there. And that's just the starting point. And then once that falls away, then you're like, oh, wait, what do I believe again? And is it really the best way to go about your life? And then that becomes more interesting once you get through the first layer of whether or not something is a historical document.
Yeah, that's interesting because, when I was a kid, I used to have questions like, but if the Quran is divine, then why doesn't it mention dinosaurs or things like that? So, so I found myself going back to a lot of these questions that I used to ask as a 5 or 6 year old that seemed very logical as a kid, but then, they were so easily dismissed, or you were distracted, and then you go back to them as an adult and you're like, no, you were actually on the right path there.
Right.
And,
it's amazing how as a kid you probably had more insight than as a believing adult.
Yeah, because your mind hasn't been fully indoctrinated yet, I guess. I mean, my parents, even though we grew up in Saudi Arabia, my parents were never like hardcore forcing religion on us. They're very like secular Muslims and liberal Muslims. So I think that helped too. Like my dad always called out like the very Salafist Saudi ideology because we're Pakistani background. So he wasn't really buying into that. And he was very irritated with the way things were in Saudi. So I heard him talk about that often at home. But things were so censored, even tech-wise. Like in Saudi Arabia, we didn't get internet till like the late 90s. Cell phones did not arrive till way, way later, if I remember correctly. And movies, like even VHS tapes back in the 80s and 90s, like everything was censored to shreds. Like if there was even a mention of another religion, it would cut to like flowers in a field or something.
Oh, not subtle at all.
No, not at all.
So I think my background's a little looser because my mother converted after a really long personal search, I gather, when I was, a small child. But so I was growing up Catholic, and I remember being Catholic, from my early childhood. But my mother was a convert, so I did not get the did not get the multi-generational Italian or Polish kind of Catholic experience. So did not grow up embedded in that kind of matrix. And so when I was older, it was quite a bit easier for me to step away from that in my teens, because this is something my mother had converted to, and I had been, somewhat devout when I was younger. But we live in a culture that is pluralistic and shows a lot of other ways, and being exposed to that and living in Utah in the early stages of when I started to fall away a little bit from Catholicism, it was pretty clear it was not the only way, and you saw a lot of other things. And my mother converted away. I quit living with her when I was in my mid-teens to go back and live with my grandparents for school in another state. But my mother converted away actually to Wicca when I was probably 15 or 16, to a women-focused, form of Wicca, Dianic Wicca, which is largely women only, right? Goddess religion. And
sounds
so
fun.
people like, oh, you're Wiccan because your mom was Wiccan and you got exposed to it. It was like, well, I didn't actually live with her when she converted, but she definitely had an influence. But even when we were Catholics, my mother was a bit of a free thinker. So she had she had books on kind of the California Wiccan and other religious movements in the 70s when I was a kid, and she had friends in various things. So it was not a straitjacket kind of religious experience. It was very much an exposure to the plurality of things in the United States.
So can I ask both of you, how did exclusivity play a role in each of your religions, or Al, in your case, in multiple religions? Because from a Mormon perspective, it's like fundamentally, it's a core part of the beliefs. We have the complete truth. If anybody else gets anything right in life, it's either by accident or, just because there's some overlap in the general Christian value sense of how to live life. But really, the only true path to God and to what we call exaltation after this life and living, an exalted life is through Mormonism. And so being less than 1% of the world population, we sort of had to constantly sweep that under the rug, like, wow, God's not very good at getting the word out. Was exclusivity like a problem, or did you both grow up feeling like it's no big deal, there's lots of religions, there's multiple paths to God, or was it a big deal that everyone eventually had to become like you?
I'll let you go first, Al.
Sure. When I was a Catholic kid, because I was confirmed in the church at like age 16, but I had already somewhat fallen away. When I was a kid, we're talking, age 5 through 13 or so, Catholicism presents itself as, the universal church. This is the way it is. Let's look at our 2,000-year history. Let's gloss over a little bit of historical details here and there about things that have happened. We don't talk about that. But it's very much the one true, Catholic church. And so there was there's a recognition, I think, being American Catholics, that we live in a society with other faiths, but it's definitely considered itself the one right way, and the other faiths are mistaken. So there's none of that there. Later on, when I'd already gone exploring, it was pretty much a self-driven process. So I was interested in spirituality, and I was interested in religious questions, and that didn't change. But I realized that Catholicism was really, quoting a rendition or version of the Bible that it had doctrine attached to, and it was the way it was, but there was already clearly multiple ways of looking at things. And so I think having that space where it was clear that it was not the one true viewpoint, and I was not 100% indoctrinated in it, partially because I don't think Catholicism in America is really strong on that for the last couple of generations, and other part because my mother was a convert, and I have family that are I guess you'd call them evangelicals for lack of a better term, but they're not. I mean, they're Nazarenes, which is a form of Wesleyanism, which is a form of Methodism. But so they were a no card playing, no drinking, no dancing kind of church. But even their church was struggling with that a little bit in the 80s, because they would sneak. The youth group would have sleepovers where we do all kinds of wholesome stuff and hang out as a group, but we would bring in VHS tapes of popular movies that the youth pastor had screened as being okay. Like we saw Back to the Future.
That sounds like Saudi.
So they were doing an end run around officially we can't go to movie houses. I believe this is when I was living with my grandparents as a late teen. I wound up going to their church a bit just because I lived with them. And one of my uncles was the youth pastor at one point. And so I had a bit of crossover there with kind of Protestant Christianity. And even though I very much so identified as a Catholic, but even that group, like I was saying, they had a rule about not going to movie houses because it supported the pornographic industry. I think was the original justification. Because movie houses back in the day would show all kinds of movies. This is what I was told.
Okay, they would have loved Saudi because we did not have movie houses. They were banned.
But they very much struggled with this. So even though that was the official rules, you'd see pastors showing movies on tape at home. And it's like, what is really the difference here?
Exactly.
That's funny because this is a little bit of a tangent, but Mormons had a big thing of avoiding rated R movies. So we got even more specific at a certain point. We had one of our prophets say something in one of our conferences to the extent of you should avoid rated R movies. And then it became a thing like, well, then should you go the extra mile? How does PG-13 fit into that? And then if you think about it for too long, some Mormons would be like, wait, why are we letting an outside institution create the standards through which never mind. It's not good to see rated R movies.
It's funny. Yeah, I don't think we discussed all the ratings in Saudi because everything that was officially available was censored. So even
did people smuggle movies in? I assume
absolutely they did. Absolutely. So it was really exciting to watch the odd smuggled movie. So usually you get we lived in compounds because we're not actually Saudi. So all the expat non-Saudis often, well, not all, I guess, many of the expat non-Saudis lived in compounds where life was a little more relaxed and women didn't have to wear a burqa all the time. You'd still have to leave the compound every damn day and deal with morality police outside and stuff like that. But within the compound, there were people who would start little video stores in their apartments, in their houses. And so they'd bring their movies, always Westerners who had the guts to do this, because anyone else with a government that wasn't too influential could get the chop. But a lot of Westerners did start their own little video stores. So we did get uncensored Western movies sometimes. But when you went to the official video stores outside the compound, everything was censored. Everything was censored. And it's funny because they don't allow movie theaters. So why do they have video cassette stores? And they don't allow, they think that, photography is a form of idolatry, but they had photo developing stores everywhere. Very strange rules in Saudi Arabia. For a school project, oftentimes I had to take pictures of, old buildings and things like that. And my dad would have to step outside the car and secretly, quickly take the photo and jump back in the car.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, because cameras were frowned upon. Now, of course, it's all different because every cell phone has a camera and cameras are now, even in Mecca, that was unheard of back when I used to live there.
Right.
So, yeah, lots of tech hypocrisy in religion.
So what about the exclusivity question for you, Ina?
Oh, yeah. I mean, there was literally no other religion allowed in Saudi Arabia. So I didn't know about other religions for a while, especially not Judaism. I did not even hear. There's a lot of ex-Muslims who have stories about very anti-Semitic families and stuff like that. So they knew Judaism and they knew what it was and they hated it, or they didn't know really, but they knew to hate it. But I didn't actually even hear about Jews. Like, I don't remember really knowing much about Jews at all until Coca-Cola was starting to come into Saudi, and someone told me it was like, I don't know, there was some Jewish conspiracy or something. I don't know. I don't even remember. And I was like, what? And then I asked my parents, and they were very like vague, and nobody really gave me answers. So yeah, I did think that Islam was the right path because that's really all I knew. But then I also had questions because I had a lot of expat friends, a lot of Americans, and a lot of, they weren't officially allowed to go to church or officially allowed to practice, but we obviously knew that they weren't Muslim. So I asked my Quran teacher, like, well, you're telling me that anyone who doesn't follow this is going to hell. But what about my friends in school? And he's like, yes, they will go to hell. And I was like so upset about this. And now I think back, I'm like, my parents really should have monitored what this loon was saying to us, because they probably would not have approved of him saying that kind of stuff. They've always been very tolerant, and, they have friends of all faiths, and they would not appreciate him saying to their children that all people of other faiths are going to hell.
Well,
so,
what about the conversion route, though? Did you grow up with sort of a asterisk disclaimer that's like, yeah, it's okay because eventually they'll get a chance to hear the truth and then they can convert, whether in this life or the next? That was kind of the Mormon answer, like, to 99% of the world not being like you, is like, oh, they just haven't had their chance to convert or to hear the truth and make a decision. Did you have any equivalent to that, or not so much?
Yeah, we did hear that. We heard that they could just, recite a verse and then they'd be saved, right? And then they'd be Muslim.
Oh, that's easy.
Yeah. So there was that, but also there wasn't a very keen conversion industry. It seemed almost very elitist. Even now, I don't see a lot of Muslims trying to like evangelize and save people in the way that Christians do,
Interesting. I wonder why that is. Like, if that's just historical, or if it's just not in focus because they feel like they've already done pretty well in terms of, the world population and their percentage of it, or I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I guess people like ISIS and there are propaganda videos and YouTube's helping to spread that message, but I just didn't get that sense the way that I've been approached by Christians, on university. Like, I've never been approached by Muslims to be saved in that way. I also think there's a bit of snobbery there. Like, if you're considered too corrupt, like, fuck off. No one's going to bother, maybe. I don't know. I'm not sure.
I was under the impression that there was a certain amount of conversion activity, at least in North America, just because I've known over the years a variety of people that did not grow up Muslim that converted.
Yeah, you know what?
Either in the 70s. Oh, yes, that makes sense.
In prisons, there's a lot of people like pushing for Islamic conversion. But in my personal life, I felt that Muslims were very snobby about it and didn't want convert people. There's no organized, missionary trips to countries. I mean, I guess if you think like the ISIS propaganda is an equivalent of that. But
I'm pretty far removed from Catholicism. I mean, for decades now, because I'm in my mid-40s. But, going to college and being around, you don't see a lot of emphasis within the Catholic Church on conversion at least in the Western world. I'm sure in Africa, where they may have inroads, quite different. But, if you wanted to go to talk to a Catholic priest on campus, there was probably, a student group that was associated with Catholicism, sometimes even the equivalent of a fraternity or a house of some sort, right? And so they were there if people found them. But they didn't stand around, not like the Christian evangelicals, and they didn't stand around with placards.
Even in Toronto, around Eaton Centre, there's a lot of these like tables. There's one table for like free Quran information, and then there's the Christian activists who are so much more active and pushy even, and the Quran people just kind of quietly sit there and they have a sign that you can come talk to them, but I haven't been approached by them either. This is so strange. I'm only just thinking about this now. It can't be real. I don't know. Maybe the Muslims are just not that organized. Maybe, I don't
Bob
know.
is probably aware of this. I mean, here in the Bay Area, you will run into Jehovah's Witnesses quite a bit.
Oh, yes.
Here too.
It doesn't matter what sign I put on my door about no soliciting. They inform me that they're not soliciting and will still knock on my door. But in the local BART stations or kind of metro or subway, they often have tables, and the same at the airports.
It's funny. The last time they stopped by, I was being nice and listening to their message, and then my wife came up from behind and just like, "Oh, it's okay, we're already Mormon." And then they were like, "Oh, thank you for your time," and then they just took off because Jehovah's Witnesses and Mormons aren't known for being the best of friends, because we're sort of different flavors of the same sort of style. So it's just an easy way to get them to remove themselves from your doorstep.
See, I love when they come to visit, because I invite them in and I'm like, "Do you want to talk about, the Church of Satan?"
Don't do that.
Yeah, no, they get scared. They have never set foot in my house. I always invite them in, but I think,
oh really?
Yeah, because I want to try and evangelize, deconverting them to them. But
yeah, I think I have similar intentions, and I'm overly nice and want to just kind of open up and just hear what they have to say. But it also takes a lot of time, and I'm under no illusions that there's any chance that either side is gonna change.
There's a progressive slide. Like the first, I've lived in my current house for 11 years. The first few years, you're nice, because it's usually older men and women, often women, grandma kind of age.
Oh, is it?
You don't want to be rude. Yeah,
here they send younger, like maybe late teens, early 20s people.
You sure that you're not mixing it up with the Mormons? That's the Mormon age,
Yeah.
19-year-olds.
Now I'm confused.
Here in Oakland, they're normally black, and they're older men and women. I don't know what the demographics of the Jehovah's Witnesses are in the Bay Area, but I assume that that's part of their demographic. And they're very polite. They're wearing their Sunday best, and they come and knock, and you don't want to be rude, at least the first few times. And so you have a polite conversation, and you take their pamphlet just to get them to leave, politely. And then when you see the same people, especially when I started putting up a no soliciting sign, it's the same. You'll get different individuals, but it's the same 6 or 8 people, right? And over time, you're just like, no, I'm not interested. Just, it's this gradual slide into impoliteness. We're Buddhists. Please leave.
I think they've blacklisted my house, because every time I say something about how Satan is awesome, then I invite them in. Yeah, they're like, "Oh God," they walk away.
When I was a neo-pagan, the neo-pagans used to share. This was back in the 90s. Used to share various what I told the Jehovah's Witnesses or the Mormons when they came to my door, stories of one-upping each other on not rude explicitly kind of things normally, though that happened occasionally, but just strange things they did. Like the time we were all in ritual robes about to do a circle in the back, and there was a knock on the door. And so you walk up holding a candle in one hand, wearing a black robe and a necklace. And you open the door, "Yes, can I help you?" Stories like that.
See, that's when you invite them in.
Well, they won't come in.
I know.
I don't like inviting them into my house anyway, because once they're inside, this applies to anybody coming to my door. Once they're inside, then you have to get them to leave.
But they won't. They won't set foot in your house.
Exactly. Oh well. Because if they're on your porch, you can just shut the door. I'm like, no, I'm not interested. Slam. Pull the blinds down.
Oh, you're such a mean. I feel bad for. It's funny how with Jehovah's Witnesses, I'm like, whatever. But then I'm like, oh, the Mormons visiting you. You should be nicer to them.
Oh well, I've only had the Mormons show up once, and as Bob knows, that they're very easy to spot.
Yeah,
they put their bicycles off to the side, and then they walk up to the front door in their white shirts and their ties and their little name tags.
Yeah,
and this is Elder so and so, and he's 20, and this is Elder so and so, and you're like, oh, hello. And then I don't even know what I said to them last time. I might have given them a story about growing up partially in Utah, and I was well familiar with their faith, and no thank you, goodbye. But I try to be polite. I generally speaking, I'm not always a polite person in general.
Let the records show Al is a polite person.
I'm often vulgar and drop a lot of F-bombs in speech, but I don't get anything out of being rude. There's no personal gain in it, in any sense. And civility in society, I've probably been raised of the right generation or with the right parents or something, that it's just like, no, thank you. It's only when they impose or they just won't go away that you start losing your temper.
Yeah. Yeah. But Bob, did you do those door-to-door things?
I did.
Oh.
I did. I tried to avoid it as much as possible because, I mean, as a 19-year-old kid, it helped me come out of my shell, though. I mean, I did all of those activities. So as a missionary, I mean, you wake up, you do your scripture study, you get ready for the day, and unless you have actual what we refer to as Gentiles, non-Mormons who are interested in hearing you teach them, and you have some pre-scheduled meetings with them, your day is all about finding those people. And since they're few and far between, where you get past that first interaction at the doorstep, that's like 80% of what you're doing is knocking on doors. And we had binders where we kept track. I'm sure it's updated now with probably more tech involved, but at the time we kept track of area maps of when the last time this had been, what we called tracked it out. We called it tracting, which is just a Mormon made-up word for going door to door. And then we had something else called street boarding, which is where you go to the center of the town and set up a display, and then have a table. And as people walk by, you try to get their interest in a polite, not too aggressive, but not too meek way either. You have to find that balance.
Do you think they'll have drones doing that eventually?
I don't think so, because Mormons
are a personal touch.
Yeah, Mormons are all about they like the human connection, and they want a chance to get you in a place where you're going to feel the spirit is what we call it.
What if it's like a drone with an iPad attached, and you can just Skype in?
I don't know. I think it'd be the equivalent of saying, "Hey, we don't need to go to church anymore. You just Skype into something. Something's lost. You're not gonna feel the warm fuzzies anymore. You got to be there in person."
But there are things like that happening, right? And that's a great segue into the stuff that we want to talk about. There's a priest. Sure. There's a robot priest in Germany that emits light from his hands, and what's he called?
While you're looking that up, I just say, Mormons aren't big on this kind of stuff because they feel like they already have the truth. They only use tech if it's a means to reaching people more quickly or getting missionary work done better. But in the end, you need to all be in the same place. You need to have that physical touch. I'd be very surprised if any Mormons actually tried to do anything this tech involved. I'm always fascinated when other Christian denominations go all in.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, he's called Bless You Too. So what are your thoughts on this robot priest that you can just go and get blessings from? As you guys were saying that a religion does involve that human touch, but as it's embracing tech, what do you think the implications of that are?
That doesn't seem very meaningful to me. I've seen demonstrations of robots in Japan that will chant the Heart Sutra, for example, that were one-offs at tech conferences or trade shows, right? Mm-hmm. And I can understand, if you're culturally familiar with something, regardless of the church or the faith, and seeing a machine kind of engaging in some aspect of it, it might be, I don't know, cute or amusing or interesting in some way. But it doesn't strike me as something that's going to be terribly meaningful, because for most people, I think religious faith or even a sense of spirituality is very much a human connection and human feeling kind of thing, either whether you're doing it solitary or with others, right? Mm-hmm. And if you're doing it solitary, you don't need technology. I'll put a little asterisk there because I can think of a few examples. But if you're doing it with others, the technology isn't really going to help unless it's a mediating device to help you connect directly to others, like, say, Skype or conferencing or something like that, right?
Right. Yeah, I'd say most of the tech that's embraced, at least from the Mormon angle, is stuff like putting your scriptures on an app, or genealogy is a huge part of Mormonism, and the fact that there are these companies, a lot of them founded in Utah, like Ancestry.com, which is all about finding your family roots. And the reason for that is there's a very specific Mormon doctrine where we go and do something called baptisms for the dead, wherein if you lived on the earth before Mormonism came to be, which, Mormonism is a restorationist sort of religion where, the world was in darkness after Jesus left the earth until God revealed the truth back through Mormons. So there's this period of a couple thousand years where a lot of people lived and died and never experienced the appropriate way to get the right ordinances, be baptized, and have a chance to accept all that's required for exaltation, all that good stuff. So anyway, therefore, Mormons are very literal, and they literally have a ritual through which they are baptized over and over again for people that came before, and it's a very special experience to be baptized for your actual relatives, so that your whole lineage in the hereafter gets a chance to accept the truth. Because if they don't have somebody who's done, it sounds ridiculous now that I'm trying to explain it to like to a non-Mormon audience, but for some reason, God is a stickler when it comes to the rules, guys. So you got to get your work done in order. Like, you can be very loving and accepting in the afterlife, but you're sort of in limbo land until somebody is baptized for you here in the flesh.
What?
And so,
this is rather infamous as a ritual as well.
Yeah, I mean, they got into trouble, baptizing Holocaust survivors or Holocaust victims.
Oh my gosh, that's pretty.
The god
Odin.
Yeah. So anyway.
So against people's will, you can baptize them after they die.
Well, if you're dead, you don't really have a will.
You don't know
sure,
what your will is.
But like
Your
if
family
someone
isn't too happy about it, that's for sure, and that's what happened in certain.
But if
contexts.
someone held like a Mormon baptism for me, like long after I was gone. Yeah, sure, I'm not around, but that would suck because, I mean, yeah, of course it means nothing, and I'm not going to be magically converted in the afterlife, but I don't want people to, like, try to save me even after I'm dead.
But if you were a believer, in the context of the faith, maybe, obviously to them it is a meaningful thing, but they've worked their way back through various lineages to basically mythical ancestors and baptize them, which is where they baptized the god Odin because in certain Scandinavian lineages of royalty, they trace their descent back to the gods, right, as living people. And so there was a couple instances where they baptized those people, given the heavy Scandinavian component in the Mormon Church.
Well, it's not an exact science. You go back far enough, and who knows if you've got the record straight, but Mormons still try to do everything in such an orderly way that it is meaningful, and they claim that the reason, I mean, there is this claim floating around that the reason the internet was invented in the first place was specifically for genealogy and for the purposes of people connecting and tracing their lineage to the point where we're all one connected chain, and everybody gets their work done appropriately and gets a chance to accept Mormonism after this life. It sounds really kooky, but it's a thing out there. And it's funny because part of me, there's a Mormon part of me, because Mormons are quick to dismiss things like robot clergy and say like, that's just silly. That's a gimmick.
I agree with them
Internet
there.
was invented yeah, but then on the one hand, they're like making fun of a robot, and on the other hand, they're like, it's actually for tracking your lineage and getting everyone baptized who came before, as if that sounds like really in tune with the human condition in a way that a robot priest doesn't. I don't know. To me, they're two versions of the same sort of silly, but Mormons are quick to make fun of one side and embrace the other. It's kind of a strange thing.
So I can think of positive aspects of technology that I've seen in, say, the last 25 years, which is with the rise of the internet, you had a lot of email lists, the equivalent of discussion forums, and that later on you had, video conferencing, things like that. But even early on with just email lists and online forums of various sorts, where places where people, congregates or interested parties can gather. And if you're not part of one of the big mainstream faiths, and sometimes even if you are, it provides a vehicle to meet either co-religionists or co-seekers, and for people to talk and exchange ideas, and maybe even to eventually, if they want, connect up in person, kind of like, Tinder or something.
Yeah. It's funny, when that first started happening, the Mormon leadership really discouraged it and released several talks on, now don't go off and have your own study groups or meet people online and, do anything that what we call uncorrelated, because then you start veering off into like logic and science and stuff,
Dangerous stuff. It also results in some really weird intersections, like there's a Reddit Muslim no-fap group, like a anti-masturbation, which is probably very traditional Islamic. But it's funny to see Muslims converge into that, because they're now crossing over and discussing these MRA type talking points, things that otherwise groups that would be against Muslims are now sharing discussions with conservative Muslims, like in their hatred of feminism and hatred of women having freedom and desire to show how much control you have over yourself, refraining from masturbating. And then there's like Muslim furries and just like really interesting intersections that would never have cropped up without the internet.
Well, it's classic internet that there's a group for, there's a group for anything. And if there's one of you in some town, there's probably one of you in another town. And,
right.
40 years ago, you would have been lonely near, I don't want to pick on furries because that's an easy target for some people. And they're not always all that strange, But, well, there are furries where it's completely just like cosplay dressing up.
Yeah.
And have fun. So I don't like the stereotype always that it's somewhat always kinky, though obviously there are those out there, for example. But just that if you
not that there's anything wrong with kinkiness.
Well, not that either. But if you were in any kind of odd or unusual or even obscure subculture, it used to be hard for people to connect. And later on, there were zines and things like that. Then there were bulletin board systems. But the internet, for better or for worse, obviously, because we've shown some negative examples, like has accelerated that. So, But there are positive aspects. Like, even for people, whether it's you want to be involved in some very mainstream spirituality, or whether you're trying to get out of something,
you
can find support and friends and people with similar experiences and backgrounds that you can, at the very least, have open communication with and talk to.
Right. Yeah. As far as the anti-masturbation side of things, Mormonism is definitely in that camp, but they're very euphemistic about it. It's like they're very shy and don't like to talk about. Like one of our leaders, there was an infamous talk called "Little Factories," and it was about how your body has like a little factory, and sometimes it overproduces. And like they teach these things. It's funny because it's like grown men and adults, but then it's like, and then you're a pee-pee. It's almost like you're teaching like a 2-year-old how to go to the bathroom.
That's hilarious. Yeah, and in the Muslim NoFap Reddit, there was a guy who offers a Skype service who will like sort of talk you down and talk you out of it. And he helps you with controlling your, desires or whatever. And it's an interesting,
so strange.
Interesting service offered on Skype.
You have to pay for
I had
that?
I had not been exposed to in any sense to the idea of a no fapping subreddit of any sort. Thank you for sharing that.
Speaking of how you're saying that Mormons aren't likely to embrace tech, I came across this Mormon Transhumanist Association. And they define themselves as the world's largest advocacy network for ethical use of technology and religion. And
sure.
It's so strange. Like, I was just looking through their Twitter page. They're linking to something called the Turing Church, and that is a community of seekers at the intersection of science and religion, spirituality and technology, engineering and science fiction. And they believe in things like technological resurrection, defined as the ability to bring back to life people who died centuries ago and whose bodies have long since disintegrated. They believe future technology will be able to copy the dead from the past to the future and bring them back to life. They believe in alien civilizations resurrecting dead people. And just really strange. Or they call it they say they believe in system operators in a higher reality who run our own reality as a simulation.
So this sounds like all standard, variants of transhumanist stuff. The only way it sounds Mormon to me, and not being an ex-Mormon, is maybe some of the priorities that they give to things like the resurrection of the past dead and such.
Yeah, I mean, Mormonism itself has a resurrection doctrine. So basically, we're living in the last days, and at any point now, Jesus is going to return. At first, it was like, soon after the 2000s, but now we're a little less specific on dates, and it's more vaguely into the future. But still, we're in the fullness of times, as we call it as Mormons, and the truths are being revealed, including all this tech. And it's only, in the grand scheme of things, it's not very long until Jesus comes back. And then we have a way that people will be resurrected based on how valiant they were during their life. And Mormons don't really whip this out until you're like deeply embedded in the culture or in the religion. Like, it's never brought up like when we're trying to convert somebody, because we know that sort of you don't want to cast the pearls before swine sort of thing, or you don't want to the milk before meat sort of doctrine. So like a lot of Mormons, if they're believing and listening to this, which I doubt there are very many that would fall into that category, they'd be like, don't share this part yet. No, they have to accept like a million other things before you can talk to them about the morning of the first resurrection. But it's there. It's part of Mormon belief that you're going to be resurrected. And that's a literal thing, and your body is going to be perfected in some way or another. And so this transhumanist angle that these people are putting on it, it doesn't surprise me, especially kind of in this postmodern mini Mormon state where now there's kind of a movement inside of Mormonism to accept the differing versions of Mormons, like they're the fundamentalists, the polygamists, now these transhumanists. But 95% plus of Mormons, as you think of Mormons, would really be uncomfortable with this and would dismiss it as just fringy stuff and somebody's pet project. And there's a couple dozen people saying they're the largest group of themselves, and it's not that it's not rooted in some aspects of Mormonism. It's just that Mormons have this weird line that they draw in the sand that they don't talk about, but that they get really upset about outsiders or other Mormons going too far across that line. Like, let me give you an example. There's a reference in one of our scriptures that says that God resides somewhere in the cosmos, and one of the closest planets to where he resides is called Kolob. And it's like the butt of every joke about Mormons. Like, Mormons believe, that God lives on the planet Kolob. And then Mormons internally are like really upset about that. They're like, no, we don't know where God lives. All we know is that there's a planet called Kolob that's close to where God lives. Get it right. And like, we're not weird sci-fi nerds. This is, there are planets in real life. This is rooted in reality. That's just one tiny thing that you misunderstood. And it's the same with this transhumanist stuff. If I were to put my Mormon hat on, I would say something to the effect of like, yes, of course we believe in the resurrection. It's in the scriptures. It's even in the Bible. But then combining it with like uploading your brain somewhere or tech, no, that's crazy, and like you crossed the line, you got it wrong. You can go right up to the line, but then after that, you're in kooky territory. But on my side of the line, it makes perfect sense.
But it's only crazy until a prophet of the church comes forward and says it's not crazy, right?
Well, that's true. But that nowadays, modern revelation, as we call it, is so far and few between. Our current leaders are super old and don't have much to say other than regurgitated crap from the previous generation.
I'm just saying you could theoretically, there could be some internal revitalization or movement within the church in Salt Lake City or something, and you could wind up with a young senior member of the church, say young like 60 years old.
Yeah, right.
and he could come forward and say, oh, I believe that the mechanism of the resurrection that we're speaking of is through uploaded consciousness and nanotechnology making new bodies for everybody. And it might be very controversial, but it could definitely, I mean, one of the strengths in one sense of the Mormon church is because it has an idea that revelations continue to come, that
Right.
it can adapt to the way to look at it as an outsider is it's able to adapt to changing social and cultural situations.
Right. Never mind that most of the time it's like 20 years late. It's like, let's give black people the priesthood in 1978.
I wasn't going to say it, but I was thinking it.
Yeah. Or right now, before they're going to tackle the subject of uploading consciousness, they have to deal with gay marriage, which of course the Mormon Church is completely against, and it's counter to everything that the doctrine stands for. In a sense, that's going to be the first thing that's going to tear them apart, and that they're trying to figure out how to reconcile, because they can't just say, love your neighbor, but don't let them go to heaven. They're trying to have this middle ground where they used to be like completely against it and did things like shock therapy and all this crazy stuff in the 80s, but now they're trying to be politically correct, but hide behind their love of gay people while still excluding them from everything. So they've got a lot of bigger problems before they can deal with like how tech and biology converge.
So how do they even practice that? Like, what can they do on a daily basis, I wonder, to be a specifically transhumanist Mormon?
Yeah.
Not talk to their bishop about it.
I'm not sure, because I mean, if they're actually a practicing Mormon, they can't bring it up in at church, because it'll make everyone uncomfortable. It'll be frowned upon. I imagine that they do it in their spare time and don't make noise about it, because, I mean, as long as they compartmentalize it and they don't evangelize, or they don't start going after some of the core tenets, Mormonism sort of lets you kind of do your side hobbies, and it's pretty open until you start saying things like, I've got new doctrines. It's like, whoa. You don't get to bottom up reveal things. That's a top down situation here in Mormon land. So as long as they're kind of doing it on the side, and they're not.
But what are they doing? Are they just like engaging in internet conversations? Like, what else can you do to alter your body technologically or?
Exactly. I mean,
well, this is like any kind of transhumanist thought. I mean, there are little things people can do, but it's mostly aspirational when the singularity comes, or when we get good nanotechnology, various things. Because, right now, like if it's about self-alteration or improvement, there's very clear limits on what people are even capable of doing. But there's a lot of aspirational thinking, right?
Yeah, doctrinally, they also have to be careful, because as part of the resurrection doctrine, Mormons are conflicted on exactly what your perfect state or your resurrected body will be like. There's some beliefs that you don't want to alter your body too much in the present day, because then when the resurrection comes, it's just going to reset to what it was. But then there's differing opinions on whether or not, like, if you get a nose job, you get your old nose, or you get to keep your new one. Like, nobody really knows. And so people sort of pick their favorite path on what that resurrection doctrine will allow for. So then the transhumanists have add another layer of complexity, where they're sort of digging deeper than the doctrine, than there is in the doctrine for them to find. And as long as they keep it to themselves and don't go too far with it, or share it too much, the Mormon leadership will be like, okay, whatever. But as soon as they think that they found something that's meaningful on the level of like standard Mormon doctrines, then it's like, no, you gotta keep that you're not part of us anymore.
By what you're saying, though, leaving aside nose jobs, I mean, it sounds like the church would have a real problem, I think, in medical technology, of embracing people being transgender.
Oh yeah, that is an open topic of much debate. What happens in the resurrection? What happens with transgender people? Some Mormons think the doctrine suggests that your biology as it was at birth is restored. Others don't want to even go there. Others yet think that you get to keep what you've decided. It's just all over the map, and it's just a place where religion falls short and doesn't have a unified answer.
Wow. So they actually talk about like what you're going to be like when you're resurrected?
A bit. I mean, it's come up more in the context of these topics where people are altering themselves
Yeah, but even like piercings are like, even just like conservative little pearl earrings are altering yourself, right?
Well, those are gone.
That's true. And actually there's it's not a doctrine, but one of our prophets in the 90s made a big deal about women having more than one piercing in each ear. Like that's like a slippery slope to sex.
What about men? I don't know how many holes in my ears I have.
Same. I think I can't even I can't even remember at the like. Yeah, I have at least 19.
Really hard not to judge you guys right now. I mean, you're probably good people, but it's hard for me to say with all the piercings you've told me about.
But when we're talking about technology and religion, I mean, leaving aside transhumanist stuff, which is, realistically fairly fringe, right? Even though if you work in tech and you're into science fiction, which I am, I mean, I've been around transhumanists since 91, something like that. The Extropians back in the day, and they had their magazine. Like that's kind of fringe and it's around, but issues of gender and gender reassignment, that's a current, important topic in society. I have more than a few friends that have transitioned in their lives, are in the process of transitioning now. And if they were actively practicing in, say, the Mormon Church or the Catholic Church, any of these very orthodox religions, this would be something very, very abruptly clear to them if it wasn't accepted or if the doctrines went against it. And when I was younger and involved in neo-paganism and Wicca, quite a few of the people I knew at that time in the 90s and early 90s especially were queer. They identified as gay or bisexual, what have you. And part of the reason why they were involved in neo-paganism at the time, which is not a technology thing, but they're involved at the time, is because their home faiths that they'd grown up in were so against what they considered themselves to be that they want pushed out of their faith.
Yeah, yeah.
I'm a gay man, and then the pastor told me I'm going to hell, so now I'm a radical fairy.
But then you find they found some other like religious identity, right? For me, like I questioned the way Islam treated women and gay people, and I was like, well, religion is clearly not for me. I did not go and find something else, but it's interesting.
Yeah, same here. I was like Christian post-Mormon for like 3 weeks before I'm like, fuck it. This is like, there's nothing. If Mormonism couldn't get it right and wasn't the one true church, I'm not going to find much here in becoming a Methodist or whatever. Mm-hmm. So and that's the path of most. It's hard for me to say definitively, but anecdotally, most ex-Mormons I've interacted with rarely find a replacement religion, and those that do would never call it that. I know that sounds kind of derogatory, but most leave Mormonism, flirt with some form of Unitarianism for a little bit, and then are out. And then some end up getting more involved in skepticism or atheism, and others just sort of are more agnostic and just religion isn't part of their life, which is kind of more my category. It's not like I'm doing conferences on atheism because it's
probably better, to be honest. Movement atheism isn't real great either. Yeah.
I mean, my post-Catholic, post-Christian experience, it kind of mirrors that in the sense that once you reject the one true faith that you were a part of, it makes on the level of being a one true faith, other religions much less attractive. So, I mean, I guess, like I said, I wound up in neo-paganism, and eventually around 2004, I wound up self-identifying as a Buddhist and engaging in some fairly orthodox Buddhist activities.
But you don't believe in God, do you?
No, I don't.
Right.
I don't believe. I mean, when I was a neo-pagan, I didn't believe in God. But I have kind of like Mulder in the X-Files. I want to believe on some level, but I maintain a healthy, I think, who knows, rationality and skepticism. But even when I was a Buddhist, Buddhists have as many doctrines and institutional closed-mindedness especially outside of, like, say, North America as anywhere else. I mean, they're traditional faiths. But in the West, just like with neo-paganism, people wind up embracing aspects of it. And the institutions, even if they even exist, are often fairly new and often posts like the 1960s and whatnot. So the way they function while definitely having their down points, is not like any kind of large institutionalized faith that maintains a giant cultural presence in a place and a certain level of social control. If you're a neo-pagan or a Buddhist and you don't get along with a monk or some teacher or something, you just like wave and move on down the road as you walk away. It winds up being very self-directed. And for me, the technology aspects are that it allowed me to connect to people and to meet people in a way that I wouldn't have if I just had to rely on the people that I knew in person.
Yeah.
Right.
Even back in the early 90s, because we had email lists. And so you're talking to somebody in Toronto or New York or in the UK, and you may or may not ever actually meet this person in person, in the flesh, but you have often relatively deep conversations, and it can be about spirituality, it can be about belief. And so there's, and that all of that is accelerated, and, often in good ways, but sometimes in bad ways, obviously.
Yeah, they actually have Quran teachers that like offer Quran lessons on Skype, like through video call to like kids in North America, and they're calling in from Pakistan and stuff. And it's really weird to me. My cousin has hired a Skype Quran teacher for her kids, and they just go in and they like video call with him and Skype with him, and he like teaches them how to pronounce things. And they probably wouldn't have had access to a Quran teacher like that in the U.S., but I don't know.
Is that good or bad? I mean, leaving aside...
To me, it's bad. To me, I'm just like, ew, why are you doing this?
You have feelings about Islam, clearly.
Yeah.
So on that level, I would assume, you feel like, I don't know about this. But in a general scheme of things... But also
allowing your child to Skype with a man that you don't know just because he's a religious teacher, like, I mean, the kid goes in the room. I'm sure she's talked to him a couple of times beforehand, but the kid goes in the room, they close the door, and like she's like reciting the Quran, and I'm like, what the, why would
is there no reason that parents not in the same room listening to the whole thing? I mean, it's not inherent in the fact that they're Skyping that they have to leave them unattended with a strange individual.
Well, interesting you mentioned that. Mormonism is dealing with a mini scandal on that front because as you progress through growing up in the Mormon Church, you have various interviews with your Mormon bishop, and that's lay clergy. They're not trained, and they don't know how to handle things necessarily on a professional level. And in order to be given the priesthood or move through the ranks of the various rites of passage, you have these interviews, and you're a 12-year-old boy, and you're going to be asked when the last time you masturbated was, and your parents aren't in the room with you.
Lie.
I mean, that's what I did, of course. That's what 90% of young boys do.
That's really inappropriate. Yeah, I would be like...
What time is it?
That's horrifying that kids get asked that stuff. Like, you have no language or no sort of way to even lie. Like, if you're caught off guard and... I don't know. I
mean, I think the real issue here is unattended access by an adult to your children in a situation where the child would have trust with the person on some level. But I mean, obviously, if you think that indoctrinating your children in a faith, and I think indoctrinating a young child in a faith is probably wrong. If you think that kind of thing is wrong, then obviously this becomes problematic. But if you are an adult, say, and you're interested in aspects of spirituality, and this is the kind of service, quote unquote, that's available to you, and say it was somebody who wanted to convert to Islam as an adult, this could be very useful to that person, leaving aside the fact that you might not think converting to Islam is a great thing.
Sure, yeah.
I mean, I used to do koan work with my Buddhist teacher that I had over Skype, because koans are normally done in an interview setting, one-on-one, in person, and you get asked a question and you respond and you do various things. And we found that doing it textually, like through email or on, didn't work very well. On the phone kind of worked, but doing it on Skype worked fairly well, because you could have the camera set up and you're sitting in a room and they're sitting in a room and you're looking at them on a monitor and they're looking at you. And it's not the same sense of, human presence as being across from somebody, But on the other hand, it's pretty close. And so we were able to do interactions in that way that we both found to be fairly useful at the time. This was not institutionally sanctioned, because like Buddhism in North America is often completely irregular. It's all lay ministers. It's people that don't have quote unquote proper training in what people consider clergy, but they might have very good training in general, like meditatively or even studying like Buddhist scriptures. But it's all done very ad hoc, catch as catch can. So you find people trying experiments like this quite a bit in the technology space. Not just say it's not all negative, right?
Yeah. I'm sure there's, the thing is that I can't separate my feeling that I think religion is negative generally. I mean, I'm not judging you or anything.
Oh, sure.
Sure, it's not negative for someone who wants to explore this. And yes, absolutely, we should have access to different ideas and ways to explore them. But kids Skyping with a strange older person,
that's just kind of creepy.
That is creepy.
But on the other hand, maybe it's better. It's better than the alternative of being in the same room, right?
That's true. That's true. I mean, when we were kids, and our Quran teacher, he was a nice guy. Well, I guess he wasn't a nice guy, but he hated everyone that wasn't Muslim. He thought they'd burn in hell.
He was nice to you.
He was nice to me. Yeah.
Than that.
He never was abusive or anything like that. Like you hear some horror stories. That's what I meant. He's not like that. But my parents did not supervise those, Quran lessons because there's an assumption, he's a holy man and he would never do such a thing.
Same in Mormonism.
Yeah.
And that seems to be a dangerous assumption. I mean, we all know about the Catholic Church scandals. There's lots of evangelical Christian or Protestant Christian scandals. I mean, I think it's any institutional faith where people get, put in these positions of authority, especially over younger people, that you wind up, I wouldn't necessarily assume it's a high percentage, but it's definitely a percentage of people doing horrible things.
Yeah.
Well, and it's so avoidable because they might say, "Oh, that's a few bad apples," or that's completely antithetical to, that has nothing to do with Mormonism, or that person was acting on their own volition. But they were empowered through the infrastructure and institution propping them up in that way. Yeah. And what's the downside of saying if the parent wants to be in the room, let the parent be in the room, or don't stigmatize that, or
I don't even think
ask
that
certain questions.
They would oppose it. It's just that many parents don't feel the need to be in the room, right? And that's the
or you can record it and review it later on fast forward. If there's no reason to leave adults alone with children in any kind of institutional setting, unsupervised. I mean, this could apply to schools as well. I mean, it's all kinds of situations.
Yeah.
Going back to the technology, we were talking about like indoctrination and reaching out and people connecting conversion. And you've mentioned like ISIS and YouTube and whatnot. And that seems to be, this is a complete topical shift here, but that seems to be a space that's both problematic and definitely people embracing, current trends in technology, right?
Yeah. I mean, extremists have really benefited from embracing current trends in technology on both sides of like the Islamic extremists and also the, Western alt-right. They're memeing and whatever, how they sneak in their white nationalism through LOL jokes and a cartoon frog. And ISIS, actually, I saw this thread on Twitter where someone was talking about how they had encountered like an internal discussion among ISIS about the validity of using autotune in their propaganda songs because because there are some stricter strands of Islam that forbid anything but I think percussion instruments. So that's it, and singing. But then the more modern ISIS people want to use autotune. And so there was some argument in that.
Oh, wow. I mean, how do you debate that? Can you go to a higher authority, or do you just let it play out on the internet? Because
how high of authority do you go to, right?
Yeah. That's the thing.
You might have your local leader or whatever, and you could also argue on the internet. I don't know. But autotune was an interesting topic for ISIS, I thought.
I'm just recalling the famous Sufi saint whose name escapes me, who played the call to prayer on a sitar and got stoned to death.
Oh, yeah, that's not surprising. I mean, Sufis are already considered heretics, right?
Yeah.
So
this reminds me of, Mormons can't drink alcohol, but I heard stories growing up of a Mormon wine taster. Because as long as you don't swallow.
Oh, the loopholes are amazing. Religious
Aren't
loopholes. I love those, especially the ones around sex.
Oh gosh, yeah, Mormons and sex. That's the Levi loving is a real thing, you know.
Levi
as long
loving?
as long as nothing comes out.
Oh my gosh.
Oh, here we go.
That's hard, though. No pun intended.
Yeah, you're right. Yeah.
What if you make a
there's all sorts of
mistake?
weird trends. Yeah, it's a big deal because in Mormonism, having sex outside of marriage is like second only to murder. So it's a huge sin that you have to go through quite the process to be repentant and get back on the path and get everything fully restored to you as an active practicing Mormon. I mean, it's a little bit up to the lay clergy again to dictate how case by case teens that have sex outside of marriage and then admit to it, what they have to do to kind of get their standing back in order. But it's a huge deal.
At least they acknowledge there's sex outside of marriage. Like, of course, it's haram in Islam too, but people do not approach teens very often with this topic because it's just understood that it's just not going to happen. No way. Even similarly, we don't have those, like, you know how they have those cautionary anti-masturbation tales, like in Christianity?
Yeah, we have millions of those.
Like you're going to have like hair on the palms of your hands. Like you're
going to get warts. Yeah.
Yeah. We don't have that as much in Islam because it's so taboo that it's just not discussed. You cannot even discuss it to say it's bad. You know what I mean?
Well, then how do you
tell people not to do it?
Yeah. Exactly. You got to have your own equivalent of a little factory story.
Yeah, they do have those, but there's no like anti-masturbation campaigns running in Pakistan, for example. You know,
no PSA videos on TV.
No.
No suggestions about tying your hand to a bedpost, nothing like that.
No, because it's just understood you just won't do it. I mean, there are like myths. When I started off blogging, I started off as a blogger about Pakistani sexuality. So I would get a lot of emails from young Pakistanis, and one common theme was, like among young guys, was that they felt that their energy was being sapped. If they masturbated, they're going to be bedridden. That's the only thing that I've come across really that's been spread. But they really seem to believe that the more you do it, the weaker your body becomes and the more bedridden you'll become. And
so many societal problems are explained right now.
I know, right?
but these people now have access to the internet. They were seeing your blog, right?
Yes.
What does this mean for them?
A lot of people emailed me and told me it was like life-changing for them. But then the discussions around sexuality turned towards like religion and how religion impacts sexuality. And then I got really into talking about religion, and now here I am.
Right. That became the focal point of everything.
Yeah, though
it's hard not to see. I mean, bringing it back to the technology topic, right? Because it's the topic at hand. Like how this is not destabilizing for any orthodoxy,
right,
that engages in control, right? Because if you let people, whether it's in Saudi Arabia, Iran, Pakistan, or Utah, get on the internet, or
I like that grouping.
There's ultra-Orthodox Jews that have, very tight strictures in their communities.
Yes, I saw that documentary on Netflix. I forget what it's called. One of Us, maybe?
I saw it as well, but I don't remember. But, any group that engages in high-level institutional control, any kind of, ready access to outside information is destabilizing of that control. Yeah. And yet we have these slabs of glass and metal that most of us are walking around with full access to the World Wide Web and the internet and everything that goes with it.
Right.
Yeah. And I guess Saudi is still pretty safe from that because they censor everything. Like I remember as a teenager, like Marilyn Manson sites were censored. It was very frustrating. Anything to do with the gossip culture. I have seen Manson in
concert 3 times, so yes, I understand.
Oh, nice. But yeah, and in Pakistan too, they I think banned YouTube for a few years. Also, the Wikipedia page for breast cancer was
But you
censored.
can't
my
really
gosh.
ban things because at the very least there's Tor and there's
Right,
VPNs,
exactly.
and
People figured
there's
out a
even-
way around it.
There's even copper phone lines. Like you could do modem level, like call another country to a computer service. I mean, that's not fast, but there's so you can't be connected into the modern world in any sense.
Yeah.
And culturally and economically, and not have it leak in. I mean, I heard all kinds of stories about Iran and satellite dishes and the way people were getting information in and out before and after crackdowns.
Yeah, even in Pakistan after the YouTube ban, like everyone was using VPNs, and so I guess they make their populations more competent in tech that way. Because you have to find ways around things. But it's scary. In Saudi, it's scary. If you are breaking the rules, there's like your heart is beating fast. Like I remember, because there's a chance that you will get like the chop, right? That's always in the back of your mind. Even though, I grew up distant from that. I wasn't exposed to it like how local Saudis are. It's still something in the back of your mind that if you go overboard, you can get yourself, your family in deep trouble, at least deported at the very least, because we're not Saudis.
Right.
So, yeah.
That's I'm trying to, it's hard to even quantify that because, all of my get in trouble stuff is like, on the one hand, I could argue from my Mormon perspective is way worse because it's my eternity is in question. But on the other hand, getting something chopped off somehow feels more real.
Right. It's more immediate.
More immediate. How do you reconcile? Wow,
and speaking of
crazy.
technology, I mean, I've heard that in Jeddah, the city that I lived in, they have a chop square. I mean, we were pretty shielded from this. I didn't know much about it because information about Saudi Arabia is very well hidden from people who live in Saudi Arabia. So Saudi censors a lot of documentaries and things about Saudi Arabia. So you don't really know a lot of what's going on around you. So when I left and I watched an independent documentary on Saudi Arabia, like I learned so much that I had no idea about, and it was happening all around me. It's so strange. Like, so this chop square where they do their public beheadings, they have like this sophisticated drainage system for collecting blood. Like, can you imagine?
Wow.
Like, they have a drainage system dedicated to blood from beheadings. It's like horrifying.
Well, if you do anything systematically, I guess you got to think it all the way through. It's a giant mess.
That's very true. However, they are very ill prepared for rainfall because it happens so rarely. So if it rains in at least the city that I was in, the city's flooded.
Oh, gosh.
I know even in Saudi Arabia, going back into the 80s, they had problems containing information about the various jihadis and the movements to go to Bosnia and various other places. So they had young men talking to people and circulating cassette tapes and VHS tapes and then meeting in small groups, and it was engaging in extremist form of Islam that wasn't being approved by the Saudis. I assume for political reasons as much as anything else.
They like extremist forms of Islam.
Oh,
But I mean, I read the autobiography by the man that was Osama bin Laden's bodyguard. In this autobiography, he talks about quite a bit about having to skulk about with various people and meet in apartments to get information, because he wanted to be a jihadi, and about getting information to do this and having to try to sneak out of the country under false pretenses and whatnot, because it was also frowned on. And even that, in that circumstance, they were circulating tapes and pamphlets, and books, and they had pamphlets and trunks that they were handing out to people, trunks of cars.
Yeah, even there was a book written by a princess, I think, about the horrible abuse that she'd suffered in Saudi Arabia, and that book was banned. But I mean, it was out there, right? Like, so they they try to contain it, but they cannot, especially now, they just cannot, which is why I think they're going to be forced to change things slowly. Now they've started with the, lifting the ban on driving on women, which is just unthinkable from when I was back there. I spoke to 2 Saudi women on my podcast, and they were saying that, women were having like driving themed parties with driver license cakes, and it was so sweet, really.
Do you know what the consequence was for driving as a woman before it became okay? And the reason I ask is because I'm curious how Saudi Arabia dealt with the implementation. Because whenever Mormons do something that was like the worst thing in the world yesterday and got you kicked out, and then today it's like, it's okay that you're black and whatever, then all of a sudden you have to reconcile the whole history of when it wasn't okay, and what do you do for those people that were punished before,
Well, there was never really a large-scale problem with implementation because women did not dare try it. It's only recently. I'm sure there's
some example of a woman somewhere that got punished for driving, and I wonder how she feels.
I'm sure there is, but again, I don't.
Concern.
Yeah, I mean, now, recently, in the past decade or so, I heard about women doing it, but because they post on social media, there's only so much that you can do to punish that woman because she's being observed by the world. They did put them in prison and stuff like that, but no.
But you're asking about the social justification, Bob, retroactively, right? Like we said this was bad, and now we say it's okay. And how do you reconcile those two, right?
Yeah, because you can't just turn overnight. Mormonism had the blacks in the priesthood example isn't a very good one, as they call it, but the polygamy. Polygamy was a huge. It was a huge deal as a core part of Mormonism up until Utah needed to become a state or wanted to become a state in the late 19th century, and then what happened?
Battling with the FLDS, right?
And there was like a few decades after the prophet came out and said, "Just kidding, God says polygamy is not okay anymore." And it's like, well, some of us are kind of a ways into this thing with a few wives. What do we do?
and it's still, I mean, it was even in the 80s. I don't know about more recently. In being in suburbs outside of Salt Lake City, you could spot polygamists any day of the week if you went to the local mall or whatnot. They were easy to spot.
Mm-hmm.
Oh yeah, they have a very interesting style of choice.
A very 19th century mode of dress and bonnets and whatnot. But they weren't. I mean, I know about the various things that happen in smaller towns and rural areas. But they were, even in Salt Lake, they were not invisible, and they weren't hard to spot. They're right out there in the open.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and even to this day, even though that happened, the change in doctrine, it's over 100 years old now. It's still something that Mormonism has to deal with, like literally on a daily basis. People still confuse, the different groupings, and also
probably because people throw it in their face as a form of hypocrisy, right? Like changing like that.
Well, you also have the instance like your great grandfather did it. Why can't you?
Right.
Well, and it's even more nefarious than that. It still exists to this day. We just don't talk about it. So here's how it exists today. Public service announcement, and Mormons hate it when I say things like this, but it's the truth. If you're a man and your wife dies and you marry a second woman, you can be sealed to the second woman, and sealed means that you can be married to her for eternity along with your first wife. So it's assumed that when you die, you will be with your two wives in heaven, even though today, in the present day, polygamy is frowned upon, and Mormons, especially in political circles and whenever they do outreach, they want to distance themselves from it. They still practice it. And because their doctrine says that if you do a Mormon marriage after you've already had one, when the first spouse dies, only one direction, only if you're a man, then you get multiple women who are your wives after this life. Whereas women, of course, it can only be sealed and married to one man.
Right.
And until they get rid of this, I mean, maybe it sounds like a stupid technicality, but I like to sort of rub it in their face, because you can't have it both ways. You can't say like, oh, bad polygamy, we don't do that anymore, and then still do it secretly behind the scenes. especially when you have a doctrine that is much more concerned with the eternities than with the with the present day. So
Islam,
that doctrine has other repercussions. I remember stories of people my mother knew in Salt Lake, probably still knows, that were older ladies that were afraid of dying because their late husband had been abusive, and by their own beliefs, once they died, they were going to join him for eternity.
Oh, that's so sad.
It's true. That's it doesn't surprise me. That could be a real thing. Yeah.
Yeah, I spoke to an ex-Muslim extremist on my podcast, and he talked about how, he was a self-loathing gay person who hadn't really come to terms with it, and he also, hated the West while living in the West, and he had considered doing something like a suicide bombing. But the one reason that stopped him is that if he died, he would have to face the fact, in the afterlife that he's gay and he's going to be punished. So that's one thing that prevented him from going all the way.
Wow.
Yeah.
So he basically did kind of an analysis and is being gay after this life is worse than being gay as a Muslim today in the current life. That's wow.
Yeah.
But there's no good endpoint in that scenario, right?
Because eventually he'll die. Right. I guess he
well, maybe he could become a transhumanist and then never die.
Well, I think he stopped believing in that homophobic stuff, so he's much more at peace with himself now. But going back to the polygamy stuff, Islam also permits polygamy and puts a number on it. It's 4 wives that you can have. And the reason that I have gotten from people that it's justified only one way is because if it went the other way, you wouldn't know whose kid is who. So in this time, it makes no sense to me because we have, technology to be able to tell.
Sure, yeah.
Why keep that rule?
Bring it around to technology. Yeah, go ask any mom. Well, if we can genetically test every child when they're from a blood sample, then how is this an issue?
Well, I mean, if the issue is cost, then that's different. But
well, I'm just how is it a doctrinal issue if that's the justification? I mean, this is leaving aside the whole question of who cares, except culturally, who anybody's parent is.
Right. And going back to the question you had about Saudi Arabia, I don't think that Islam itself forbids women driving. I mean, obviously there's no scripture against women in cars because there's no cars, and there's instances in hadith of women on camels. But this is a specific Saudi Arabia thing. So I think the people wanting to change it now can just say that was never Islamic to begin with.
Okay. So there's kind of a threat of separation of church and state or something. You just sort of throw the political institution under the bus and you're like, hey, I mean, that's a different thing. That's how they implemented laws and stuff. We still are okay by
I wouldn't say that they want to separate mosque and state at all there. They just have a different interpretation going forward, maybe.
Okay.
But
interesting.
Let's quickly talk about maybe religion in space.
All right.
Yeah.
Sure.
So, I mean, I read this article about a Muslim astronaut and the challenges that he was facing in terms of praying in space, because without a lack of gravity, you really can't face one direction specifically. And prayer times are all messed up because they're based on, sunrise and sunset times on Earth. Fasting is near impossible because of the sunrise and sunset thing again. Also, they do this ablution ritual with water before each prayer, and water in space is scarce. So these are all things that were challenging for him. And then I think he found some imams who reinterpreted scripture and told him that, maybe just face Earth if you can while praying. It's so... To me, it just says that, if religion is only able to be practiced on Earth, then maybe it's not all that divine.
That idea has come up, specifically about praying towards Mecca has come up in science fiction fairly often.
Really?
Less the weightlessness and the fact that, if you're a Star Explorer, imagine Star Trek, and you're on the Enterprise, and you're actually a Muslim, even though apparently there's no religion in Star Trek, but you're actually a Muslim, and you're moving at warp speed through the cosmos. How exactly are they supposed to pray towards Mecca, right? I mean, it's the same kind of problem.
Yeah.
One would think in a religion that's not ossified or is culturally responsive to its members, not just institutions, that people would come up with a rational accommodation, right?
Mm-hmm.
We just pick your arbitrary time is a time in Mecca.
Yeah.
And so
right.
And so that's when when dawn is in Mecca, that's when your dawn is. Except because you're going around the planet, so dawn and dusk come over and over again, and you're moving, and face towards Earth and strap yourself in so you're not floating around. And handy wipes are good for washing.
Yeah.
Yeah, Mormons are a lot more pragmatic in this on this topic. I mean, the whole creation story and how God organized matter and the earth came to be and where we go after this life. There's sort of a theme of we may not understand it, but the cosmos are definitely this way that God organizes things that we just don't see or understand completely, but that'll be made known to us in the hereafter. And so I can't think of anything prohibitive of if Mormons were to go into space, or if our species was eventually able to colonize another planet or something. It really wouldn't get in the way of anything, because we don't have anything that's so temporal as to affect us.
Maybe it is the one true religion.
That's what I'm trying to say. I wanted to end with some pamphlets I'm going to mail you guys.
What if you landed on the planet Kolob and
no, stop with Kolob.
or was it Kobol, as in the first Battlestar Galactica?
I know, right? That's another fan favorite. I think some Mormon was involved in the writing room of
that's what
Battlestar Galactica, and they just changed around some syllables and references, but half of the basis of that TV show is Mormon related.
This is the 1970s Battlestar Galactica, where it was very Egyptian themed, and they were looking for Earth, but they originally come from the planet Kobol, which they found in the show, which was covered in pyramids, and there's a bunch of this ancient astronauts stuff going on.
Oh, I've never seen any of them, so I'm probably missing all your references.
It's a product of the 70s.
And now I'm going to get a lot of hate mail for saying that, aren't I?
There's definitely inside of Mormonism a healthy appreciation of science fiction. And in fact, one of Mormonism's claim to fame is the author Orson Scott Card. I don't know if any of you have read Ender's Game or saw the movie. I mean, depending on...
I'm going to suppress a rant right now about Orson Scott
I know. He's just as famous for his homophobia as he is for his science fiction, which is not doing Mormons any favors. Or maybe it is. I don't know. It depends on which side of the fence you're on. But anyway, I guess there's not that much to say other than that there's a healthy appreciation for science fiction inside of Mormonism, and even in some of our doctrines that we use as the basis of, look at me saying we, that we use as the basis of showing how we're more enlightened and have more knowledge from God. Or we talk about things like God organized humans out of intelligences. We use verbiage sometimes that's very in tune with the laws of thermodynamics.
Oh, there's some vague Islamic science out there. It's so silly though.
I mean, I think the Mormons benefit from having been founded in the 19th century.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
I mean, the more recent your strange cult that becomes a religion is founded, the more in tune with, in some sense, with modern science and sensibilities.
Very true.
To a limited extent, it's likely to be, or at least to acknowledge it, right?
Yeah. And I mean, it cuts both ways, because on the one hand, the history is so fresh that you can kind of see all of the breadcrumbs and reconstruct how Joseph Smith is a narcissistic, seeker of sex, wanted to facilitate all of his desires through creating an institution. I mean, that's the most cynical read, but it's not hard to read up on what was really going on 150 years ago. But at the same time, there's not as much to reconcile on some of these other things when you're dealing with ancient religions that are very much a product of their time and place. I'm sure you both struggled with that whole like, oh wow, how come God didn't reveal any like practical sanitation advice of thousands of years ago or whatever.
It's interesting I've been talking a lot about Catholicism just because of my youth. It's in the space of Catholicism, at least in the last century, in the last say 60 years, they've been relatively willing to acknowledge, unlike a lot of the other Christian faiths, facts of science. So the Big Bang, at least when I was still Catholic, the Big Bang was recognized as a acceptable explanation, with God's hand, of course.
Same in the Muslim circles that I was growing up in. There was never this hardcore, rigid adherence to creationism. I mean, there are Muslim groups like that.
Evolution and said, "Oh, that God's hand guiding."
Exactly.
That's fine.
Yeah.
So there's that. I mean, I identify, these days largely if I had to pick a strand as a Zen Buddhist, with the little asterisks there. And when we talk about space and technology and whatnot, as an American Zen Buddhist, not part of some 1,000-year-old institutional structure in Japan or China,
right?
Like it's all very flexible because believing, Buddhism has all of the problems with hardcore doctrine and unquestioning, like, things handed down, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, that's very much a present thing. But as a Western Buddhist, you can call us dilettantes at times or not, but as someone who's effectively picking and choosing the aspects that work or appeal, like the idea of an astronaut who's a Buddhist is like no big deal because like Buddhism is about human experience and the nature of human existence and suffering and things like that, and how we're dissatisfied with things without really getting into it. And so the idea of a astronaut, reading some words of the Buddha and engaging in some meditation, it's like, oh yeah, no big deal.
Yeah, not a problem.
Mm-hmm.
Probably do it in a secular. I mean, there's lots of mindfulness, which is ultimately derived from like Buddhist meditation. I'm fully expecting that there's astronauts up there, within the last 2 years that were doing meditation on like the space station, right?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Al, you bring up a really interesting point. I like how you had disclaimers attached to the way you identify yourself nowadays. And I think there's this propensity, like it's hard to like put a label, like if somebody were to ask me like, what are you now in your post/ex Mormon state? And I'd be like, I don't know, agnostic, atheist. And then people would dissect that and be like, okay, so which thing do you subscribe to? And it's like, gosh, and I know, I wonder for you if you have issues with this too. Like it's sometimes words escape me when people want me to explain my current state of how I think of the universe. It's not so simplistic as to find one label and subscribe to it. You know what I mean?
Sure. I mean, it's also very context dependent, right? If I do Pilates and hang out with some kind of wooey Berkeley people, and if I'm
Nice.
talking to them, and I know some of them have, they believe in energy work and they believe in this and they believe in that. I'm going to frame things a little bit differently than if I'm talking to a coworker who's a friend. Therefore, it's an okay conversation to have. Right? A coworker who's a friend who I know like doesn't believe in anything, and it's not antagonistic, but like basically is an atheist and doesn't want to participate in anyone's bullshit.
Right.
But they're asking me like, what do you do? What do you believe? And then I'm going to frame it more in the language of the person that's going to hear it.
Good point.
Like I was alluding to earlier, I mean, in kind of a X-Files, 1990s X-Files says, Mulder, I want to believe. I mean, I definitely have spiritual leanings, some of which are probably, I wouldn't say unexamined, but not necessarily justifiable as far as aspects of belief. But when it comes down to it, for myself, I was born in the early 70s. I'm a product of late 20th century North America, been through several, religious institutions in the course of my life. I've been exposed to others like through family and whatnot. And so, I came at it from a self-indulgent, self-exploratory, depending how you want to look at it way, right? Finding things that make your life, my own life, work better and to cope with the pain and frustration of existence in the world. So, in one sense, I don't need to justify it to anybody else, but in another sense, like it's very clear to me that there's a lot of bullshit out there that people believe, told to believe, or the book says to believe it. And that kind of unexamined, like just embracing of it, like is completely antithetical to me. I mean, if you want to embrace like a Gnostic myth or some story from the Bible or some story from folklore because it's meaningful to you, meaningful is the key word here, not because there is some god or gods out there telling you that this is the reality of things and everybody else is wrong. Because I don't see how. It seems like a very difficult space for various traditionalist religions to exist in the current era and not have any kind of self-examination or even questioning of what they believe. Because even a cursory look, there's so much BS.
But even outside of traditional religions, there's like the dogmatic atheists sort of that have replaced prophets with these other personalities. And so while the term atheist describes me just fine, it's the baggage around it that I cringe at. It has certain connotations with it. And I'm always like, I'm not that kind of atheist, or even the term ex-Muslim. The movement was such it was such an amazing thing for me to find that there were other people leaving Islam talking about it. And it was so noble, like this goal of destigmatizing apostasy from Islam. But now it's become this strange vehicle for a right-wing agenda, sort of teaming up with Dave Rubin and, I don't know, people normalizing people like Dennis Prager and InfoWars.
Isn't the problem here a bunch of angry dudes being angry? Basically.
Sure, but there's a lot of ex-Muslim women too. There are some that come from very extremist backgrounds who sort of view Islam through that lens, as if everyone is the extremists that hurt those people. And that's certainly not true. So I feel like they're not going about critiquing Islam in a very reasonable or rational way. That's why they're happy to make racist jokes with Ann Coulter or, this is just not what I signed up for. So I become more and more hesitant to use the term ex-Muslim, even though I'm still using it for now.
Yeah.
But do you guys have any closing thoughts?
Closing thoughts. Be nice to your Mormon neighbors.
You're on a mission here.
Yeah.
So to speak.
Yeah, well, I oscillate between burn it down, fuck it all, to we're all the same. It's fine. So maybe some of what I said during the course of this conversation is making me swing the other direction. It's not that bad, especially when I hear the crazy shit that goes on in the Muslim communities. Mormonism is quite tame by comparison. So
you know what? In some ways, I find it a lot more extreme. There's no of course, we have jihadists and shit like that, but there's no on a regular moderate Muslim level. There's no organized sort of, I don't know, going door to door and. You
don't have 60,000 strong. You don't have this army of youth that's going out.
See, to me, as someone who grew up as a Muslim, that seems pretty crazy.
Yeah, that's true.
Well, I mean, that's just the aspects of missionizing religions, which any form of Christianity has been at one time or another.
Yeah, and I mean, to be fair, my family was very progressive, liberal, mild Muslim, and I think Mormonism is probably one of the more devout, more, I don't want to say
orthodox
extreme.
Or
more orthodox,
practicing, or
more orthodox types of Christianity.
Yeah,
right.
Yeah, because there isn't. It's true. There isn't a middle ground. At least some liberal Mormons like to pretend there is. But you can't drink. You can't have sex before marriage. You have to give 10% of your income to the church.
Oh, we have that too.
Oh,
when I lived in Pakistan, the banks would just extract it on a certain date, from your bank account, and so we would be scrambling. There was some loophole form that if you sign that form, they wouldn't take it. So the night before, everyone would be scrambling, going to the banks and be like, no, don't take my money. So crazy.
My Methodist grandfather paid 10% of his income to his local church, for my entire life. Or his entire life.
But did it have the stigma, if you stop paying, then you can't go to the temple, you can't do anything at church, you can sit in the pews, but you can't have any position of authority. So
no,
in Mormonism,
but
it's very...
Susie taking the collection plate would notice and word probably get around. Right?
Okay, so it's more indirect. Okay.
Yeah. It was just expected. I think it's expected. It was expected in Protestant denominations.
But how do they calculate the percentage is accurate? Like what if
it's self-calculated? It's just the idea was is if you were a good Christian, you were tithing 10% of your income.
So you're trusted to give 10%, whereas in Pakistan the bank just takes % of whatever's in there.
The bank just takes care of it for you.
Yeah.
Yikes.
Yeah.
As far as my closing thoughts, I think a lot of it comes down to, for me, think of the technology front. In reaching people online is, I don't know, the ability to connect with people and even people that definitely have different viewpoints was something that I've always seen as a strong point of the internet and the connectivity and the rampant, self-filtering, bubbles, radicalization, and divergent groups of the last couple of years has really put that to question for me, right? Because if you would ask me all this kind of stuff 10 years ago, I'd say, no, the internet, it's a uniform good.
Mm-hmm.
It made such a positive impact on my life. Completely not depressed in any.
Yeah, but it made a positive impact on ISIS's life too, right? So,
it's not about the needing aspects of sitting home alone playing on a computer too when I was younger.
Yeah.
But I would have thought it was a good thing because I connected to so many people and I'd made friends that were literally on the other side, like in New York City, that I'd never met in person, that I'd been friends with for 10 years and it was all good. But Reddit, which is not all bad, but Reddit of the last few years and things like the 4chan, the Chans, and then Twitter and Facebook have kind of put that all very much to question. And then one has to ask yourself, is that the nature of online communication, self-sorting, or is it because things like Twitter, Facebook, social networks are accelerating and worsening those trends with their algorithms, right? With the way that
YouTube,
data,
especially, right? How it predicts, how it sends you to worse and worse videos, and then next thing you know, you're a white nationalist.
Right. Oh gosh.
I'm going to feed you more of what you already like and want, and it's the brave new world aspects. And is it online and technology inherently lead to this, or is it because we've gone down a darker path and it could be turned around if people either the services changed or people disengaged or nurse services came online, or I don't know, right? I think inherently that more communication is better, and the internet at its core is a communication tool, but we've definitely seemed to have gone through a major shift in the last 5 to 10 years compared to what it was for 10 or 15 years before that, because it first became really popular around 94. And the internet of 1994 to 2004 is very different than the internet of 2004 to 2014 or 2006 to 2016, right?
Yeah.
Think of Obama and in the last couple of elections and things like that.
Yeah.
Yeah. Isn't this how it always is? Something's super cool and almost utopian, and you're like, this is awesome. The rest of the world should have it. And then everyone gets it and you're like, fuck, we're still a bunch of idiots.
Yeah, but you go back and you go, oh yeah, the early 1990s internet before the big web boom, and then right after, that was so cool. We had these great communities, and you realize, and we were all a bunch of Asperger's white guys talking to ourselves and screaming at each other and saying, you need to grow a thicker skin, and they're like, yeah, and fuck you, and that kind of thing. And it was just a bunch of dudes fapping away at each other on the internet. And so it wasn't an inclusive community, and it wasn't broad, and it only became inclusive and broad later on. But I also still put part of the blame on, as much as I love Twitter and I hate Facebook anyway.
Me too.
I put it on both of those as well, because anytime you respond to anything that's a divergent viewpoint on either of these systems, if you don't personally know the person, in person, in the flesh, and they're a friend of yours, it just goes down such a complete hole immediately.
Right.
Don't even bother to respond. It's not even don't feed the trolls. It's don't even bother to respond to any somewhat negative viewpoint, because it's just going to become accelerating.
Yeah, that's so true.
Make that a million, amplify that a million times, and what you get, right?
Yeah.
Well,
so speaking of religion and technology, do you think, I got this question from a Twitter friend of mine, Jason, and he was saying that, do you think religion embracing technology, is that just a form of what it's always done to try and like appeal to younger people? And the example he used was like a rapping vicar. Or is religion truly trying to update itself?
No, rapping monk. So, yeah.
Yeah, you think it's just another rapping monk or vicar?
I think people exist in their cultural context, like, and rap is a thing, for example. And so why wouldn't you be a rapping guy plus whatever your religion is? Because it's 2018, right?
Mm.
Yeah, I think religion is very selective, at least in my experience, is very selective on how it embraces technology. So if it can help spread the good word and make it more efficient, and you can highlight your scriptures digitally and share passages more easily and search, certain indexes of sacred texts, that's all well and good, because that's all with the you're playing bumper bowling. You're looking at the right stuff, and you're just being able to take advantage of it all the more. But as far as embracing the complete openness of it, I think those barriers are still going to go up.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, because they don't want people free thinking amongst themselves while reading these scriptures, right?
Right.
The loss of authority and control in any institution is going to be a constant problem. They want a responsible adult indoctrinated in the right ways to be interpreting things. And this doesn't just apply to Mormons. I mean, this applies to
everyone.
Pretty much any faith that's organized in any fashion, right? And any faith that's not organized in any fashion, give it 200 years and it probably will be. So,
yeah. Right. All right. Well, on that note, thank you both for coming on and having this very interesting conversation with me. I thought it was a good chat. And where can people find you, Bob?
Yeah, so I'm on Twitter at Bob Caswell, and I also have a couple podcasts. One of them is Mormon related. It's a bunch of ex-Mormons kind of just exploring life after Mormonism. That's called Infants on Thrones, which is a weird title, but it's a throwback to a Mormon doctrine about babies becoming gods if they die before the age of 8 here in this life. Little esoteric. And then I also have another podcast called Practically Culture that I host with another ex-Mormon friend. We've been friends for over 20 years, since high school. And we just talk about movies, video games, TV shows. It's almost like our attempt to it's called Practically Culture because it's like, as if there's things to talk about other than religion after you're out of it. So those are my little pet projects.
Cool. Check that out, guys. And you, Al?
Yeah, so I blog very occasionally, starting up again at openbuddha.com. And I'm on Twitter as Lorem Gibson, and that's LOREMGIBSON. It's a little joke, but mostly, there and on my blog, I talk about science fiction, tabletop role-playing games, geekery, and computer security stuff occasionally, and only occasionally about religion and specifically Buddhism on my blog on occasion, but that's about it.
All right, cool. Well, nice chatting with you guys.
Yeah, likewise. It was great.
This was good. Good time.
Yeah. Okay, take care.
You too.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thanks for listening to another episode of Polite Conversations. You can support this podcast by sharing the shit out of it, making some noise about it, or contributing via Patreon. Patreon.com/Nice Mangoes. No Ian Mangoes. Also, you can follow me on Twitter at Nice Mangoes. If you want to make a one-time donation instead of a monthly Patreon one, you can do so via PayPal. nicemangoes.blog@gmail.com. Remember, no Ian Mangoes. If you've got an interesting story and would potentially like to be a guest, you can email me there too. A special thanks to Dylan Beck for theme music, sound, and production help.